Hi everyone. I'm just going to go through some of these slides and explain a little bit about media theory. Um, I will, I'm definitely going to skip over some. So let's get started. This is an overview. I'm pretty much going to skip the mediatization and the politics part because we are just in such a crazy world of media and politics under this Trump administration. So this whole area of research actually happened before the active audiences research. And part of the reason why the active audiences research came about was in a reaction to media effects research. So, media effects research was all of the people trying to figure out how media affects us, and focusing a little bit on, politics, as it says up here, the press and democracy, and then entertainment and children. So, especially as television became prominent in people's homes in the 60s, this was a big concern. And then, but what happened is that it's difficult to determine media effects because there are a lot of other variables in a person's life. So, does watching violent media make children violent? Um, you know, wouldn't it be different if there's a child who has a lot of other positive things going on in his life and parents who are teaching him that he shouldn't be violent and church that talks about loving one another, versus a child who might be in a home where he witnesses domestic violence, or in a neighborhood where kids have to fight to protect themselves. So it's really difficult to tease out all of the variables to be able to say that the media has this effect, any kind of effect on people. So this is historically, this hypodermic model, silver bullet theory about strong media effects kind of came out of World War II, when Hitler used a lot of propaganda in Nazi Germany, and then the horrible things that happened there. And so people kind of thought, whoa, media has an immediate and strong effect on people. But as they started studying media, they realized that it really didn't work like that. So this is why we get more to this, like around the 60s and 70s, this big push towards limited effects. So what kinds of effects, when, under what circumstances, but not just that there's this whole big powerful thing. So one of the, I'll talk about two-step flow. This is one of our theories. Two-step flow is that there are opinion leaders and opinion followers. And so opinion leaders pay attention to the media and to issues. And then there are other people who don't pay much attention, and they get their information from the opinion leaders. So, I mean, if you think about voting behavior, right? So maybe you've got somebody, who doesn't pay much attention to what's going on in the candidates, but they really trust their good friend from church who does. And so whoever that person recommends will probably be the person that you would vote for. I'm that way with elections like school board elections and my local elections. I just don't have time to really pay attention, but I have a couple people who I really respect, and often I will kind of ask them about it. And then, right, so that's where we get the importance of interpersonal relationships in that. And then, as I just mentioned, active audience research came up as a reaction to this. They were like, hey, why are we always talking about what the media does to us? Why don't we think about what we do with the media? Because we're not just empty, brainless beings, right? Okay, so I'm going to switch here. So this slide does not talk about agenda setting. It mentions new agenda setting players. This is changing, but I do want to mention agenda setting because it's one of our first theories related to media. It's one of the biggest ones, and it was actually started by researchers at UNC in Chapel Hill. Don Shaw, who is still alive and recently retired, he and Max McCombs, who's now at University of Texas, came up with this. So what they did, this was 1968. It was published in the early 70s, but the election in 68, they looked at what newspapers were talking about in terms of what issues were important in the election, like the Vietnam War, maybe let's say the economy of the country. Sometimes it might be immigration. There are always certain issues that end up healthcare, certain issues that end up being dominant. And then what they did is they did a huge survey of thousands of people and asked them what they thought were the most important issues in the election. And when they, did the calculations, it matched up. So the things that were being talked about most in the media were the things that people said they were most concerned about. And it wasn't that the media was telling people what to think, but it was telling people what issues they should be thinking about. So that's why we get agenda setting. So the media sets the agenda for what people believe is important. So this slide really is just talking about, how professional journalism is no longer definitely setting the agenda, right? To what degree is social media setting the agenda? And these are all questions that people they still use this theory, but they're using it to look at new ways, new technologies, and new ways that media might be setting the agenda. This is a really interesting one. I was kind of surprised they mentioned this. The spiral of silence. It's basically kind of people develop their opinions and they don't like to be in situations where they're being challenged about their opinion. They seek to conform. And this is not all people, right? Some people love to challenge opinions, but it's that if you have an opinion that's unpopular around the people you become silenced. Like you don't open your mouth about it as much. And I have to say that I feel like I've been experiencing this recently. So this is my example. My children go to school in Chapel Hill, and Chapel Hill schools are considered to be very good schools in the state, but they have a horrible problem with equity. So brown and people of color, brown and African American and Hispanic children are the achievement gap is way too high between them. And so the new superintendent apparently has a huge focus on improving equity, right? So making sure that not that everything is equal, but making sure that the people who need more help get more help. And I am totally on board with this. But I have found that a lot of the middle class white women, especially in my neighborhood, who profess to be liberal and are all for equality, when you start talking about this, they seem to think that like their children are going to get less. Like giving someone else more help means that their children are not going to get anything extra. And it's really troubling to me. And I've started to notice that when I try to bring up these kinds of things, like the reasons why equity is important, they start to give me they look at each other, give each other looks, and like, oh, there she goes again. And if the topic comes up and I'm sitting there and someone asks them about it, sometimes I notice they nod over to me like they're not going to give the true answer because they know I'm sitting there and they don't agree with my opinion. And so I've started to express my opinion about it less, just to kind of listen to what other people are saying and not saying anything, which makes me really unhappy. But it's kind of like I'm not going to get people to agree with me just by saying it. So I don't know what the purpose would be. Um, this is the other thing, right? There's a lot of focus. We talk a lot about media effects in a bad way, like negative things, but there's also a whole area of research that has to do with the positive media effects. So, what can we learn from media? How do children learn from media? How do cartoons help them learn? Sesame Street is a great learning thing, especially when it first debuted. Um, Teaching children about social skills, right? Being kind to others, sharing, all those kinds of values. So we want to also think about what we learn from media that really helps us, right? This is the last theory and the last slide I'm going to talk about. Cultivation theory is a really interesting one, and it's one that we still use also. This is basically that we grow up in such a media saturated environment that we kind of don't notice the things around us or question them. So it's kind of like it changes the way we see the entire world. And I'm going to give you a video about this, but the main researcher was George Gerbner, and he was at the University of Pennsylvania. And he was curious about violence in media because the thinking at the time was that watching violence made people violent. And he said, well, if that's true, then I watch, violent movies and I'm not violent. And, I'm not going to go down the street and mug someone just because I've been watching these violent videos. So he wanted to try to unravel that and understand it. And what he actually found in like years and years, decades of research, was not that media made us violent, but it made us more afraid of the world around us. So if you watched a lot of violent media, you were prone to think that people weren't as nice, that you might be in danger if you walked down the street alone at night, that your house might be broken into. And so I'm going to attach to today's class. It's that same film company that I use, the Media Education Foundation, for other films. But I only want you to watch the preview of this film. If you want to watch the rest of the film, you can. It's a really good one. But the preview gives you helps you understand. And in any of these theories, the big question is, so what, right? So what? Does it matter, right? If we are if we're more afraid of the world based on how much violent television we watch or movies. And what George Gerbner eventually was able to prove was that people who were more fearful of the world around them, of being a victim of crime, were more likely to vote for politicians who had a tough on crime stance. So even though crime rates were actually declining in the United States in like 2010, people were more afraid and they were voting for politicians who were tougher with sentencing laws and things like that. So I think that's the important thing, is the consequences of this kind of media impact on us. All right, so that is today, and I told you I would give you a video about this. I will talk to you later.